And now to move on to our panel. So if you have been following us for the last few days, one of the things that came up particularly yesterday was this concept of literary executor and the need to form a literary executorship, or to be very smart about who is going to manage your work. Copyright lasts your life plus 70 years, and that plus 70 years is it's an additional lifetime. And we really do want to make sure that whoever's caring for that work is the right person and is going to do right by you and your work and your legacy, in both upholding your intent and, so to speak, exploiting your work to the maximum that they can. So with that, we have with us the incredible Ellen Brown. She is a lawyer and an award-winning nonfiction writer, and her work specializes in literary, legal, and publishing history. So she's super unique and super interesting. So I'm glad she agreed to do this. She's currently working on a biography of the playwright Tennessee Williams, which I hope we'll hear more about. Will be available hopefully soon. Ellen will tell us more. She is a member of the Biographers International and the National Book Critics Circle. So welcome, Ellen, and thank you so much for being here to help us understand everything we need to know in 1 hour about literary.
We're going to cram a lot into a short period of time, but I'm happy to be here. I'm so delighted that you have that entity that you just described. And I think writers or creatives in a lot of different fields are going to wish that they had something similar available to them. I don't know of any other trade group that has something like that. And I just, all of you playwrights out there, I think you're very fortunate to have that source available to you.
Oh, thanks. Well, we're happy to have you here. And, you know, one of the things that I was reading recently was an article that you wrote for the Dramatist magazine, which I believe is on our website. If not, you could probably get it through the Dramatist Guild. And you started it off by saying, you know, when a doctor passes away, they're no longer helping their patients. When a plumber passes away, they're no longer servicing your bathrooms and kitchens, but not so with a playwright. Do you want to sort of elaborate a little bit on what?
Sure. So when all these other professions, the career dies generally when the person dies, right? But with a writer, because of the 70 years that you mentioned, that the copyright exists for 70 years after the playwright's death, subject to certain different jurisdictions have different rules, but we'll just go ahead and say in general 70 years. And the question is, that career is still going without you. Your career is still happening without you. And so the goal of a literary executorship is exactly what you said, is picking a proxy who is going to stand in your place regarding those decisions that need to be made regarding the copyright. And even more than the copyright, your legacy, your reputation, your papers, things like that. It's somebody who stands in place of you and the decisions you're making on a day-to-day basis.
So let's just try to define exactly what the literary executor is. It's not necessarily the person that inherits the work. So who becomes a literary executor? Do you have to name one? Does it you know what is it defined as? You know?
Okay, so I'll give you a very short primer, and maybe this came up already yesterday, so maybe this is repetitive. But if you die with a will, you typically designate in that document what's called an executor, just a general executor. And that person's job is to accumulate all your assets, accumulate all your debts, pay off the debts, pay any taxes that are due, and then take the property that's left over and distribute it to your heirs. Okay. If you don't have a will, that person is called an administrator, and the court will typically appoint somebody who makes sense, like your spouse or your child or something like that, to do the job. So it's that person's job to kind of step into your shoes immediately after the death and then get things distributed. Now, a literary executor is not somebody recognized under that legal system. A literary executor is just somebody that you appoint to say, I would like you to give input to my regular executor when they're making decisions about how to disperse my property or manage my property until it's dispersed to the heirs. And then once the property is dispersed to your heirs, your executor could be in place to advise your heirs. So a very common situation is a playwright dies and leaves all of his copyrights to his wife and children. Okay. Now, say the wife and children don't really have much interest in copyright management or know how to manage copyrights effectively. Or maybe they all know a lot about it and have very different opinions on it. Say maybe the wife loves Broadway and wants to get everything on Broadway, whereas the children are like, no, integrity off Broadway. Let's do tiny little theaters downtown. That's our vibe. They might disagree. Well, a literary executor is the person who kind of steps in to say, okay, wait a minute, let's do what the playwright wanted. He cared, she cared about these things. Let's do it this way. They're basically advising how to manage those choices that come up.
And is it really necessary for everybody to have a literary executor? I mean, I know some people may say, okay, we're talking Broadway, off Broadway, but I haven't even gotten there. So how much effort do I have to put into this? Because it's a whole sort of ordeal finding someone, which we'll talk about in a little while. Is it really needed for all types of estates, big, small?
It's never, and it's not an absolute. Can your estate survive without a literary executor? Yes. And I would say probably the vast majority of them do survive without a literary executor. But I don't think you can make the decision based on whether or not you've hit it big yet. Presumably, you feel strongly about your work and believe in your work. And maybe it's just a simple case of your work is ahead of its time, right? Like if you haven't had that breakthrough that you've been looking for yet, that doesn't mean your work isn't quality, doesn't require proper management. It just may not be its time or place yet. So if you have faith in your work, regardless of the external indicators of what a lot of people would call success, if you have faith in your work and believe in its quality and want it to have its best chance of succeeding after your death, or to have any chance of it succeeding after your death, then yes, I would say you need a literary executor. And we were just talking about a couple examples of writers who died before they hit it big, and really, I'm sure, wish that their estates really wish they had literary executors in place. Most famously, the one you guys probably know the most about is Jonathan Larson, who wrote Rent. I don't know, he died during previews. So the play was building momentum. It was on off Broadway, or was it off? I can't remember.
I think it was off.
Yeah, it was just like
on that. It had just sort of begun.
Yeah, it was just building steam. I mean, like it had the markers that it was going to do well. Like people were interested in it, but it was by no means a sure thing that it was going to be a hit. And I guess he had a heart attack on the night of previews, or the night before the opening. And like I think everybody went to the party, and he didn't show up, and they were like, "Where is he?" And he hadn't felt well and had gone back to his apartment or whatever and had passed away. So that play went on to tremendous amount of success. And I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing he probably did not have a literary executor in place, because why would he have thought of it at that stage of his career?
But it's a good point too to remember. You never know. It's never really too early to think about all of these things.
It's never too early. And got to tell you, Tennessee Williams, and I will mention his name a lot. And if you get tired of me mentioning him, I'll stop. But he's freshest on my mind. He was thinking about literary executorship and writing to people about it and designating them constantly, starting in 1940 or 1939, 5 years before Glass Menagerie. I mean, his first big play. He was convinced that what he was doing had some merit. He didn't know what it was. He knew there was something to what he was doing, and he did not want to die and have his mother accidentally throw everything away. That was his goal, was to prevent his mother from like going in and taking everything and being like, oh, what is this junk, and tossing it. So that's
do you think that having a literary executor sort of increases your chances of having this like sort of post-mortem fame?
Absolutely. I mean, your after you die, your estate can do marvelous things without a literary executor. You may be extremely lucky to have a spouse, a child, an agent, a loved one who is going to take on your legacy as their cause. And if you're lucky enough to have that, your estate can do well without an executor. But the key is the chances of that happening are very slim, right? Because who is going to devote their life to managing your legacy? Because they probably all have lives of their own. So having an executor in place substantially increases your chances of your work finding an audience after your death. Because unless there's somebody who knows that they're responsible for doing that,
Mhm.
it's a crapshoot whether anybody's even going to think of it.
And, I think you told me that Emily Dickinson, wasn't it also that her poems didn't?
Well, so there's two great examples of writers who found great success after their death without it ever even seeming a possibility. The sad story is what's his name? Hold on a second. I had it here a second ago. John Kennedy O'Toole, who wrote Confederacy of Dunces, that novel. He had tried for years to get it published. He kept getting close. It kept getting rejected. And sadly, he eventually committed suicide. He was so dejected over his unable to get that book published. After he died, his mother also kind of had a nervous breakdown because she was so wrapped up in his suicide. And then about 5 years later, she found the manuscript on a bookshelf somewhere, and she decided to really fight for it. And she then just went tooth and nail fighting to get that book published. And finally, after years and years, got it published. Not only did it become an immediate bestseller, it won the Pulitzer Prize.
Oh,
so,
wow.
I mean, it can happen. Emily Dickinson, you just mentioned, she died in 1886, 55-year-old poet who had published maybe 3 or 4 things during her lifetime. Like nobody had any idea who she was. And her sister-in-law found a box filled with her poems that, her poems are very short, and they were written on these little scraps of paper and on the backs of envelopes and things. And I believe it was her sister-in-law who collected everything, who said, wait a minute, well, this stuff is amazing. Why did we never see this before? And she's the one who went out and found a publisher for it. And without that sister-in-law, we would never today know who Emily Dickinson is. There really is it's lightning striking, but if you believe in your work, it seems like it's worth trying, right?
And I mean, one of the things that sort of is a theme that seems to be running through a lot of what you're saying is just how much family ends up getting involved. And I would think that having this one person who you've chosen and selected, or that you knew, or that you had that relationship with, would really help everyone get along better as well.
Absolutely. Because, and that's actually a great point. In the Emily Dickinson case, the family ended up in an enormous feud over this. So the sister-in-law, and there's probably a historian in here who's going to correct me because I'm getting some of the details wrong, but
feel free to let us know if we are in the chat.
Yeah, somebody raise your hand if I'm getting the details wrong. But there's whole books written about this, where there's 2 branches of the family who have claimed entitlement to Emily Dickinson's work, and they view themselves as the keepers of the flame. And if you go to look up an Emily Dickinson poem, they're generally numbered, but the numbering is different based on which version of the estate was publishing the poems, because there were warring factions within the family, and they came out with 2 different editions, and they numbered them differently. So and then there's a museum, and then it's like they're supported by the one branch of the family, and some of the papers are at one university, whereas the other papers are at another university. So she's an ideal situation of somebody who should have had a literary executor because she was so gifted and had so much work that needed to be managed, and because her family did kind of fall apart arguing over who was the appropriate person to be in control. So if you have just one relative who you love and trust and no other problems, maybe you can just assume that person's going to do the job right. But if there's any chance of conflict, you're actually doing your heirs a favor by saying, you know what, I'm going to take this out of your hands so you all don't have to argue about it. And this is the person that I'm going to entrust to do it.
You kind of making me think about something else too. When you have a co-author, say, if it's for a musical, and I might be jumping ahead, so
No, that's fine. You go wherever you
I don't
want.
want to jump ahead, but do they usually then pick the same person, or do those end up being two different people that have to try to get along?
So I don't think there's any usual when it comes to literary executors. There's no such thing. Really, it's up to the unique individuals involved, what's going to work best in their circumstance. You had mentioned that question to me before, and I had honestly never thought of having a joint literary executor with a co-author, because presumably both of those writers, the composer and the writer, are going to both have bodies of work separate from what they've done together.
Sure.
And so it wouldn't necessarily make sense for them to have one person who's weighing in on both of those things, because you're going to want this person also handling all their other work, and they're going to want this person. But what I see that it could work. I don't think it's a bad idea. I just hadn't heard of it. And I see potential for conflict. But the other thing to keep in mind is that you can have joint literary executors. You can have multiple literary executors. Tennessee Williams always had three.
Oh,
He until the very end, and then he only had two. But for most of his career, he had three in place, named at any given time. And he was constantly changing them. But he had his agent, his publisher, and a friend as a troika. And the three of them were responsible for making decisions jointly.
fascinating. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Gee, somebody just wrote in that the chat's not working. So if you have anything to just say in general or a fact correct, just put it in the Q&A and we'll read it off at the end and make any corrections we have to. I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about what the literary executor does, because I think before we could start thinking about, well, who are our three people, if we're lucky to have three people to put in that capacity, what exactly is the job? What are they doing?
So similar to my last question, your last question is, there is no right or wrong way to define a literary executorship. It's a very flexible concept that depends on your unique circumstances. So that's the good news, that you can really define it however you want. In general, things that you see literary executors doing it can be very vague. It can be a mission as broad as protecting your legacy, right? It can be something as general as just making sure that people are making good decisions, not overly commercializing things if that's not what you wanted. Or if you did want things commercialized, if your goal was make as much money for my heirs as possible, that the executor would be the person pushing the agent and the producers and finding deals and doing that sort of stuff, like exploiting the copyright the way you would have wanted it exploited.
And oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and then I was going to say, then you could get into very hands-on type things where the executor could be handling copyright renewals. They could be dealing with your papers, coming into your office and collecting all your unfinished manuscripts wherever they may be, and collating them and putting them into a form and saying, okay, now we could start pitching these manuscripts. They can be dealing with academics who want to start writing about your body of work. They could help decide who writes the biography. They could vet potential biographers and say, all right, we want to authorize this person to be the biographer. They can decide what archive your papers will go to. And I'd like to point out that a lot of these things are things that you could also do while you're still living, right? Like, you could get your manuscripts organized while you're living. You could decide where your papers go. But if you didn't do those things, you could theoretically leave that to your literary executor to do.
And what sort of authority does the literary executor have then to do these things? So you enumerate what you want them to do, like find a publisher for these works and try to
Right.
put together an anthology of my unpublished plays. What gives them the right to do all of that?
So this is a tricky question, and I do not want anybody's eyes to glaze over once we start getting into the nitty gritty of legalities. The short answer is that, as a general matter, literary executors do not have authority to really do anything. at the basic level, they are advisory. They are in an advisory capacity because the property will be owned at your death. The property will be owned by your estate right after you die until your estate all gets worked out. And then once the estate is cleared, the property is then owned by your heirs, whoever you decide inherited the copyrights. So the executor technically never owns the property. And because they don't own the property, they don't have the legal authority to do anything. So then the question is, what's the point of having a literary executor? Well, of course, with anything legal, there's ways to make things happen if you want them to happen. And one way that you hear most commonly in context of literary executorship, and there may be other ways of doing it, is to put your property in trust and to name your literary executor as your trustee. So what that means is, instead of giving your property to your heirs outright, where their name is on, the deed to your house or your car or whatever, or your copyrights, instead you set up this entity called a trust where the property is held for your benefit, for the benefit of the heirs, but the heirs don't have the control over it. And you could put your literary executor person in charge as a trustee who then does control the copyrights, but does not own them. It's all owned for the benefit of the trustees, and this person is just there as a manager.
So I think that it's important then to sort of distinguish, the royalties versus the decision making, because those are very different things, and they don't have to be connected, I suppose.
That's very true, and I think a lot of people misunderstand that. So when you're deciding what's going to happen to while you're still alive, you make all the decisions and you get the royalties, right? It's all in one basket generally, unless of course you've contractually granted a share of your copyright to somebody else, like Tennessee Williams. I think this is lovely. For the Glass Menagerie, right when that play came out, he gifted his mother 50% of the royalties to the Glass Menagerie, just outright gave them to her because she had desperately been wanting to divorce his father and couldn't afford it. And so she went from being this, abused housewife to all of a sudden owning half of the Glass Menagerie, and bought her freedom. And she lived the rest of her life, a very lovely and happy life off the royalties that he gave her. But I don't think most people do that. You retain the power and you retain the royalties. When you die, though, you can very easily split them up. You can designate the power either through a trustee or some other legal mechanism, and then just say to your heirs, okay, you're not going to make the decisions, but you are going to get all the money. So you can split it up that way if you want to. Now, sometimes you can make one of your heirs your literary executor if you want to. So that's another thing to keep in mind, and maybe we'll get to that in some of the other questions.
Yeah, I mean, I want to shift to sort of how to pick, but I just had sort of one question as we're talking in terms of sort of their loyalty, because it's, again, it seems like here, if you're not around, is that literary executor generally going to try to maximize the revenue, try to appease the heirs, try to uphold your legacy, and
it's a tough job.
Yeah, and how do you, I guess it goes to the question of who do you pick, but how do you make sure that it's what you want? How do you sort of impart that information?
Well, so you're not going to be around to enforce, right? You're going to be gone. And I cannot tell you the number of estates where I know for a fact that things are not being done the way the playwright or the novelist wanted things to be done. I mean, it's very common for those things not to be done the way, no matter what the will says, they go off and do their own thing. So you're never going to have 100% control. But for me, this entire exercise is about communication. And I think that in a lot of those cases of where things are being done wrong, it's because there wasn't adequate communication up front. And so the key is, you as the playwright, you're going to select this person. There's no point in doing it unless you're going to sit down with that person ahead of time and tell them what you expect them to do and what your priority is. Is it maximizing the dollar value, or is it preserving the literary integrity? You also have to talk to your heirs. A key step in all of this is saying to your heirs, look, You're going to own the property. You say you don't want to get into this trust complication. So you go to your heirs and say, look, I'm going to leave you this. You're my wife, my child. I love you. I'm going to leave you this copyright. But I am asking you to do what my literary executor says. And please, for God's sake, put them in charge and let them do it. And hopefully you will introduce them. There will be a chance for them to get to know each other and understand each other. And the more you can do while you're still living to get people on the same page, that is how you avoid conflict. That's to me almost more important than the legalities of any of this, because the legalities can get expensive and make things tense, and who knows whether it's going to be enforced anyway. But if you're communicating with people what your desires are and introducing people, getting them on the same page, that can go a long way.
So in terms of who we pick, I would assume somebody younger maybe than yourself. But I would think that this person also has to have some amount of savvy, or some certain, what would you say are certain, like the top traits to look for?
So youth is actually my favorite.
Okay.
It's funny you said that. So I think it was W.H. Auden who very wisely picked a young academic to be his literary executor. So this guy built his career on being the one who had control of the Auden estate. You know, he loved Auden, wanted to do everything to support his career, and has done an amazing job, right? So that's why we know who Auden is now still, or those of us who do. It's very important to pick somebody who is younger than you and will outlive you and can keep your name in conversation long past the people who are of your own age, because they're presumably going to die around the same time you do, and then you've got nobody in place. So, but there's all sorts of people you can choose. And don't let age be the key consideration. It's just one to take very seriously. Other types of people that are typically considered are agents, your agents. And several of the big literary agencies have entire divisions where they do nothing but represent literary estates. And that's very easy for a lot of people. There's a clear payment structure. They're paid for what they're doing. They have staff, they have know-how, they have resources. They presumably already know your work. They presumably already have it all organized. So that's
is that something you can just sign up for, or it's
yes,
like
you
getting
sign
a
up for
regular
your
agent?
agent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
I see.
several of the big agencies have, like, and I know somebody, in fact, her job is she manages literary estates for an agency. Like, she's just has that one little niche. So that's a possibility. Now, I'm going to go to Tennessee Williams. By the time Tennessee Williams died, the last person he wanted managing his estate was his agent, and he took the agency out of his will because he was worried that they were going to try to sell his copyrights outright. He was terrified that the agency was going to pitch to the estate, hey, you know what? We're going to keep all this really simple for you. We're going to sell everything to ABC. And you're going to get this fat stack of money for all of Tennessee Williams's copyrights. And you will live the rest of your life off of this money. And then ABC would then be in charge of all of the copyrights. And then he was like, they're going to go off and do a soap opera of A Streetcar Named Desire. They're going to have a Summer and Smoke, cartoon. They're going to have Sylvester Stallone in Streetcar, these things he was terrified of happening, made for TV miniseries. He was horrified. So he did not want his agent to be the one making the decisions when he was gone, because he was afraid they would overly commercialize the property. Now, the person he did keep consistently, almost to the bitter end, and he did in the end cut this guy out too, was his publisher. He trusted this guy, James Laughlin, who was a close friend and the editor who did the literary versions of his plays. Now, interestingly, that guy knew nothing about plays. He knew nothing about play production. He knew nothing about the theater industry and didn't even care about the theater industry. But what mattered to Tennessee was that he understood poetry and the poetry of Tennessee's writing and its literary merits. And that's what mattered to him. So he liked having that guy. A lot of people choose a spouse because if you've been married a long time, this person knows your body of work, has a vested interest in it. And in many cases, especially in the olden days, wives were famously great literary executors because they had to live off of the estate, right? Because women didn't have another job. And so they had children to support. So of course they were out there pounding the pavement to keep these plays in production or to keep the books in print because they needed the money to live off of. And so that worked very well for male authors who had younger wives around doing this for them. Whereas for women, it hasn't always worked out that well because the husbands back in the day typically had other careers and didn't know that they were supposed to be managing this copyright after the death. And I think it was it Emily Bronte's husband? They had only been married a very short while when she died. I think it was Emily Bronte, or maybe it was Charlotte. He was clueless. He had no idea that there was even anything for him to do. But luckily, other family members stepped in to help. Now, there's a story about a wife who did a terrible job as a literary executor, and her name is Harriet Shivers.
Okay.
And I can't see if anybody knows who Thomas Hawley Shivers is, but I'm guessing they don't. Do you know who Thomas Hawley Shivers was? Does that ring a bell?
I don't, but I'm sure someone in here does.
No, I bet they don't, because what happened is
Oh,
he was a poet from Georgia who was best friends with Edgar Allan Poe. Potentially, I think they may have been lovers. I don't know. I can't prove that. But a lot of Poe's ideas came from Shivers directly, undisputable. Poe would be the first person to tell you that he took inspiration from him. But why do we know who Poe is, but not Shivers? Well, one reason is because Poe's mother-in-law, who was also his aunt, was a greedy son of a gun, and she kept his stuff in print because she was living off the money from those copyrights. So she kept Poe in the conversation because she wanted the money from it. Harriet Shivers was a wealthy, was more wealthy. The Shivers family owned, it was a plantation owners in the South. And she also hated her husband, which I learned when I was thinking about writing an article about why is this poor poet that nobody knows who he is. And I was so sad for him until one day I was in this tiny little library in Georgia, in Washington, Georgia, where the library had done an exhibit of Shivers memorabilia in like 1910. And so I wanted to go see the material that was still at this library. And there was a walking stick, and they had the tag that had been the label from the exhibit. And it read, let me have the quote here. It said, "This historic stick was used by Dr. Thomas Hawley Shivers in his famous wife-beating escapade in Washington, Georgia. The nick in the wood was made by the good lady's skull."
oh my gosh.
And so I went, oh, that's why she did nothing after his death, because she hated him, obviously,
Wow. So well, it's best to pick someone that maybe you don't,
somebody who likes you.
you don't hate.
So a good example of somebody who liked somebody was Lorraine Hansberry's ex-husband. So they were divorced, but they remained in contact with each other and still liked each other. And she left him as her literary executor. And, he went through exhaustive efforts to keep her in the conversation. That's why we still know who she is today. And in fact, he remarried, and his daughter then became the literary executor when he died, because so Lorraine Hansberry's ex-husband's family ended up being the ones to carry the charge for her after her.
We had a conversation with them last year, if anyone's interested to hear about even the differences between when the ex-husband was managing versus the daughter managing, how different choices were made. It's like super.
So I'm really interested in that. Was there a distinction? That's what I was curious
about. There is. I'm gonna send everyone over to our YouTube channel to watch it though, because I'm not going to say it exactly correctly, and I don't want to speak incorrectly, but it's fascinating just to, again, see how even people that have the best of intentions have different views on how to manage something. And that's so critically important, I think.
There's no, and like I keep saying, there's no right or wrong answer to any of this. And what's right, say, in 1955 is different from what's right in 1975 is different in 2015. Times change, so that's the other thing, that it's very difficult to put somebody in power now, and you tell them everything you're thinking right now, when you can't possibly know what the situation is going to be 50 years from now or 20 years
And
from
that
now.
sort of brings up a good question too of whether or not we need a successor executor, because you might do all this work and communicating with this one individual, and then they pass away, because again, it's a long term, and who's left with the work? Maybe someone you never intended.
Exactly. And
And
so it is a very good idea to have a successor in place. So what some people will do is do a spouse and then a child, or maybe they'll put their agent in, say, for the first 10 years, and then put the child in later, so that when the child's a little bit older, say like your kids are in their teens or 20s, well, maybe you don't want them to be in control now, but you hope that they're going to mature and they're younger, and so maybe eventually they'll be ready for the position. So yeah, it's nice to have a succession plan in place if you are fortunate to have people that you trust enough to do that with.
is there any kind of remedy if say you pick the wrong person?
So unfortunately, there's not, unless you can get the will overturned. I'll give you two examples of terrible choices of literary executor. There was a science fiction writer named Alfred Bester. He left his entire estate and the executorship and everything to a bartender who he barely knew. He was just a guy that it wasn't like his favorite bartender that he hung out with. It was just a guy he occasionally bought drinks from. And that his Bester's work ended up going out of print, and only like true science fiction fans even know who he is, because his work has just not been maintained because this guy didn't care. And there's nothing anybody can do to force those works into publication if the heirs don't want it published or don't bother with it. Another one is, oh geez, I'm going to forget her name. Really well-known novelist. She picked her cleaning lady to be her executor. It was supposed to be Robert Giroux of Farrar Straus, big time publisher. And at the last minute, she just kind of said nope. And and it was her Filipino cleaning lady who didn't speak English or spoke very limited English. And this poor woman had no idea what she was getting herself into.
Right.
And there was nothing they could do short of proving her incapacity. And I don't think they were able to do that. Yeah.
So once you sort of pick who you are, I mean, I guess I'm just wondering if there are any literary executors listening in on this call as well.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that. That would be interesting.
But I'm just curious, like, what are some of the bigger things they may have to contend with? Are there lessons that we've learned that so that we can sort of pick the right person to handle this kind of obstacle that might come up?
Absolutely. So I have a few key takeaways on who you want to pick, right? Because there's horror stories on, everybody can go bad, but then there's also all these great stories too about people who did really well, like the Hansberry estate. Margaret Mitchell's estate was handled beautifully. Tennessee Williams's estate was ultimately handled very well, although you hear a lot of stories that it wasn't handled well. The key is to pick somebody who trusts and understands your vision for your work. It would be nice if they knew something about literary rights and they were somehow in the business or affiliated with the business. Someone who's going to live a long time after you, and someone who cares enough to do a good job. So those are the key considerations. And the other question we were talking about earlier, I think, was at what point in your career do you pick this person? And my advice in terms of how to make things work smoothly, you said, what can you do to make this work smoothly, is to pick this person earlier rather than later, and to make sure that you ask them if they're willing to do the job. Don't make this a surprise that they find out after your death.
Sure.
You tell them ahead of time and you let them think about it, and you explain to them what you want them to do, and you get their buy-in. And a key consideration that they may ask you is, am I going to get paid?
Sure. Yes. Let's talk about that. I'm sure that's a good question.
And to ensure that your executor does as good a job as possible, it might be smart to make sure they're paid in some way. One example of an estate that didn't go so hot even though the candidate looked like a great candidate was Dorothy Parker, when she picked Lillian Hellman to be her literary executor, on paper, Lillian Hellman fit most of those criteria of knowing the business, caring about the business, knowing her work. But the problem was Hellman had her own career to take care of, and she's not going to drop everything to all of a sudden start managing Dorothy Parker's career. And so a lot of things got left by the wayside that probably should have been done. And most famously, some of you maybe you remember this, I think it was in the New York Times a few years ago, that when Dorothy Parker's biographer went to go find her grave, he couldn't find it. And he went to the lawyer who represented the estate, and he said, "Oh, I have her ashes sitting in a filing cabinet because Lillian Hellman never bothered to bury her." And I bring that up because it's a legacy question, right? As if you're a famous writer, you want to be buried in an appropriate circumstance, right? Like, it's nice to have a grave where people can go to and pay homage to you.
Right.
And people put a lot of thought into where they're buried for that reason. And, Dorothy Parker didn't even have a grave. I mean, so what does that tell people? And the other issue is, I don't want to cast aspersions too much on Lillian Hellman because I don't know that much about it. But part of the problem was that Dorothy Parker, she had left all the money and the copyrights to the NAACP. And so she had not provided for Lillian Hellman to be paid anything. And so Lillian Hellman was essentially being asked to work for the benefit of the NAACP, which was not a cause that she apparently felt that she needed to be spending her life advocating for. I don't know what her racial viewpoints are, so I don't want to call her a racist or anything. I don't know. But yeah, so that was a disconnect there, right? That she was being asked to do the work and she wasn't
Not really getting paid. So how much do you pay? How do you arrange that?
Well, it's tough because, especially if we're talking about writers, like we were saying, if you haven't hit it big yet, do you have any money even to be paying this person? One possibility is giving them a percentage, right? Saying you would get a percentage. I'll name you as an heir and give you a percentage of the royalties to share with my other heirs. Or you could set a flat fee that is paid out of your estate, or you set up a fund if you're fortunate to have that kind of money. That's a possibility. There's all sorts of creative things I suppose you could do to deal with that. There you have other assets.
And this would be something that your lawyers then drawing up in these. So can we talk a little bit about, we talked a little bit about it yesterday in the tools and tips section about like sort of the legal maybe criteria, but can you go over that a little bit? How do you find the right lawyer and what should we be asking?
That's a great question to start with.
There? Okay.
How do you find a lawyer who's going to do this for you? And the one thing I wanted to make sure everybody understood is that a lot of lawyers don't know anything about copyright law. So while you may have an estates lawyer who's like, in your hometown or wherever you live, or your brother-in-law is a lawyer, you think, oh, he can do my will for me. This is easy. Don't be surprised if they know nothing about copyright law, because copyright law is a very specialized area of the law. And even if they do know something about copyright law, they may not have ever heard of a literary executor. They may have no idea what it is, because as I mentioned earlier, it's not a legal concept. It's not something that originated in the law. It's not like your executor or your administrator that are defined in statute. This is a literary executor is something that's come up out of the literary community, right? So, and that writers have done this as a tradition. It's not something that the law trains lawyers to know about in law school. So chances are, unless you go to a lawyer who's a New York City specialist, probably the people who've been speaking on your panels, those are the best people to go to. But if you wanted to go to somebody in your own community, it's going to be more cost efficient, somebody you know and trust, going to be easier for you. That's fine, but you may have to educate them a little bit. Mm-hmm. And what I even had to do, because I'm a writer myself, and when I went to my own local estate lawyer to do this, I had to give him a copy of my articles on literary executorship because he had never heard of it. So and I have another friend who's an entertainment lawyer, and she just gives my article to everybody when she's doing things, because I'm not saying it's perfect, but it at least will educate people in one easy place to say, this is what it is, read about this, and then they can go do further research. So the Dramatist Guild, you can probably get back copies of the articles. I wrote 2 articles for them. And I think on my website, I have the article I wrote for the American Bar Association about this. And I think you can just download that right off of my website or from the American Bar Association.
And I'll make sure your website's posted in the chat as well.
Great.
But
and just because they haven't heard of it doesn't mean they can't figure it out. Just
right.
don't.
I mean, that's actually something we were talking about yesterday, where one of the attorneys on the panel was saying, I might bring in, he was a trust and estate attorney, didn't really work with theater people, but said, I understand the issues, and I might bring in a copyright attorney to consult with me on a job. So it could be something like that, where
absolutely
bring somebody in to kind of get that, that understanding. Is that something that you do?
Well, so I used to, I don't anymore, because I'm currently just focusing on writing on the biography, the Tennessee Williams biography. And it's something I think I will eventually go back to doing, because I feel like there's a need for it. I really do. I find it so interesting. And I wish as a young lawyer, I had stumbled onto this as a practice area, because I think there's a lot of need for it.
I just want to ask one more question, then I'll go to the Q&A, I promise. We've been talking a lot about the fact that literary executor doesn't really have the authority that a general executor might under the law. So what kinds of things can we do to give that person some amount of authority and some teeth to it? And that's a little bit probably part of what you'd want to discuss with your lawyer as well. But what are some of the things that can be done?
The broadest thing you can do, the most powerful thing you can do, is name them a trustee, is to take that extra step of putting your property in trust and naming them a trustee. And there's many, many other advantages to doing that anyway. So honestly, if you have an estate of any substantial size, there's a lot of reasons to put your property in trust anyway, because it avoids a lot of taxes and avoids a lot of problems. And also it provides you a higher degree of privacy than a will does, because wills are filed in the courthouse, whereas trust documents, portions of them can be kept confidential. So a lot of people do trusts anyway without regard to this issue. So if you're going to do a trust anyway, and you want your literary executor to have power, name them a literary trustee. It's a trustee, but parentheses, the literary trustee.
Mm-hmm.
Say if you have 3 trustees, this one's the literary one, and he's going to have the say, or she's going to have the say over these things. If you don't want to deal with all that, the key is communication ahead of time. I would go ahead and put it in a will, designating who your literary executor is, even if a court may or may not be familiar with that term. I think it's great to have it in the will as a clear expression of your intent. And then also communicating with all of these people before you die and making plans for what you want to have happen. I think that's the most important thing. And get your papers organized. That's the other thing. For God's sake, do not die with your office a mess like mine is right now. I had to tidy it up before this, where they walk in and they can't find your great American play,
right?
Because it's buried under a pile of papers. If they're going to be able to do an effective job, they need to know where your manuscripts are and things like that.
Yeah. Actually, we have a document available. I'll plug it for those that didn't come last night. There's a document on our website right now in the materials section that will just help you collect all the basic information about every play. And I would encourage you to just take a look at it, because it's just leaving that information in a written out in a nice way with your authorial intent and who's involved and who do they need to know, and definitely worth taking a look at it. I'm not sure if it will be available after this week, so maybe download it now, even if you don't want to do it. That way you'll have it.
I have to tell all of you that you're here is a great first step, because a lot of people turned a blind eye to this, and of course they die and they don't know the mayhem they've created. But I'm telling you, it creates mayhem every single time when this stuff is not done ahead of time. So it's great that you're here. That's a great first step. That's more than a lot of people do.
So I'm going to start asking some questions from the Q&A, and feel free to use the Q&A if you do have a question. The first question is, they're asking if the executor of their personal will can turn over the work to a literary executor after the death. So how does that work?
If you name the literary executor as your heir.
As your heir.
As your heir. So the executor's job is to execute the will, means carry out the terms of the will.
Mm-hmm.
And they can only give the property to whoever you have designated to inherit the property.
Got it. But you could have your children inherit the property and then name a third party with some payment scheme and just hope that everyone.
So that's okay. So that's the hope. Your executor has to do what it says in the will, and that they have to give it to the heir that is designated in the will. But what you should do, if you don't want to go to the trouble of a trust and all this other stuff, is sit down with your children and say, look, I'm leaving you this property, but if you want any money out of this, you don't manage it. You're going to hire Bob Smith or Sally Jones to manage it for you, because that's the person I trust to do the managing. Yeah.
Got it.
You cannot, but if the executor transfers those copyrights to your literary executor then owns that property. And you may or may not want that literary executor to own your property. You probably want it to go to your heirs, your family members.
Right, but at least the income portion.
The income portion, yeah.
Somebody's asking, is a clear articulation of your values as a writer a substitute for a literary executor?
It's not a substitute. It's a great thing for everybody to have, though. Absolutely. It's great. It's a great first step. And if you only have that, I would say you're better off than a lot of people. But yeah, no, that's not going to be enough in a lot of cases.
So Bob here is asking, does the literary executor have any real power? I think we somewhat covered that, sort of.
They're generally advisory only. Their job is to advise. It's almost a misnomer. You could say that we call them an executor at all, because they're not an executor. They're not executing anything. They're an advisor. It should be called a literary advisor is what it should be called. Now, the reality is that if you put the term literary executor on your will, and that impresses everybody, and people will play along with it, then it can work out great and you might get away with it. But if somebody challenges it, they're going to have a tough road in court. So does that make sense? Where it's the kind of thing where it is technically advisory, but a lot of people place so much stock in the term literary executorship that they do tend to wield a lot of power de facto, as opposed to actually legally having the authority to do these things.
Got it. So we have a couple of questions again on how the literary executor is compensated. I think we covered that, so I'm not going to ask that question again. But if you're still unclear about it, just write it again in the chat, and we can always say it again. Somebody is asking if there are people who specialize in this sort of thing. Is this a profession, or is it usually just a trusted friend?
So there are fiduciaries that you can hire that are independent fiduciaries that do this kind of work. I personally don't know of any who specialize in literary. Otherwise, I would give you the names. I'm guessing there probably are. But the great organizations at the Dramatist Guild is the service that they're offering, I think is really exciting. Again, agents do have people who do this. So that's another thing to talk to your agent to see if they have a division or recommended a division that does it. So there are professionals in this field. I do not know of anybody who is professionally a literary executor. And I think there is a need for it. I think it is a growth field because there are so many people. I get this question all the time of like, who should I appoint? And it's like, oftentimes it's just the family are the only people there. Yeah.
Kate has asked her niece to look after work, but she lives in the United Kingdom. Is that a problem if the person you've appointed to care for your work is not actually in the same country that you are in?
It can cause complications, absolutely, because they're not going to be around if something comes up. They may not have their finger on the pulse of what's happening in the industry today. Sorry to keep saying Tennessee Williams, but Tennessee Williams's literary trustee was British, and it caused a lot of problems because she was so focused on doing West End productions in London And then she didn't trust a lot of the American directors, and it caused mayhem because the Americans were so upset. They were saying, Tennessee Williams, this is our great playwright. We want to be able to stage these plays. And who is this British woman to tell us we can't do it? Now, that was their perspective. A lot of people would say she did a brilliant job, and it was great that she was from out of town and that she didn't have the New York mentality. So again, two sides to every coin. Just be prepared that yes, it does. You're smart to ask that question. It could pose complications, but it may turn out to be great as well.
So someone's asking for a little bit of clarification. If the literary executor is the trustee, so you put all your works at a trust,
Power.
name that person the trustee, does the money go to the heirs, or how do you make
Yes.
sure the money goes to the heirs?
The money goes to the heirs. The trust's sole purpose is to make and keep money for the benefit of the heirs.
Or wouldn't it just be whoever you designate as beneficiary, though?
Yeah, beneficiary. Yeah, they wouldn't be called an heir. That's a good point.
Right.
They're not an heir at that point because they're not in a will. They're a beneficiary of the trust. Yes, all the money goes to them minus the fee, the fees of running the trust.
But you would name the beneficiaries. So in other words, you could put people that were not your technical heirs.
Oh yeah. You could put anybody, you can name anybody you want as a beneficiary. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's the beauty of it. The trustees do the work managing it, and the only money they get is their salary. Everything else is managed for the benefit of the beneficiaries. And that can be anybody.
Somebody's asking if there's any reason not to do a trust besides costs and whatnot. We touched upon that a little bit yesterday too.
Wow. You raised a good point that I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, we were talking about copyright reversion and how technically under the law, if your works are passing through a trust, through any other tool besides a will, the rights of copyright reversion would continue to exist. So, and if you want to learn more about that, you can revisit some of our past conversations. I don't want to derail this into a copyright reversion conversation, but something to look into. So maybe write that down, or you can always call us and we can chat through that. What name should the literary executor be named in a will or in a trust, since calling them literary executor is not legally authoritative? So I guess authoritative. So they're asking, is there a specific title or tag word that should be used?
I wish there were, and there's not. I mean, the term that people use is literary executor, but that's really just by literary tradition, as opposed to any form of legally recognized construct. And I hope I'm not making it sound too doom and gloom. I think the concept of literary executorship is so well established and so well regarded that probably 95% of people operating in this sphere don't know that it's not a legally enforceable term. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's a respected position. It's acknowledged, and people do tend to respect literary executors and take their input with appropriate seriousness. So even though they are not technically in having the power, I do think they're worth having and can get a lot done. So I hope I didn't come across as too doom and gloom on that.
God. So somebody's asking, I mean, I think you said Tennessee Williams had 3 different literary executors. Is that recommended? Should there be more than one, in your opinion?
Totally depends. I mean, you got 3, that means you got to pay for 3. It depends. So primary consideration is how much money do you want to spend on trustees? If you've got unlimited resources, it couldn't hurt if there's a lot of complicated issues, but I would say in most cases, there's probably just one, just for efficiency's sake, right? Because if you have 3 and they disagree, then you have to set up, he had a whole voting system set up, like if it's 2 against 1, and, one would be the most efficient.
Got it. We have one question. I'm still a little bit confused by literary executors for musicals. I'm the librettist and the book writer lyricist. I appoint a literary executor. The composer is going to appoint a literary executor. And I assume the literary executor for me and the literary executor for the composer are going to have to agree to things before anything would happen to some project. So there's still a potential conflict down the line, even if you did appoint somebody.
But that's no different than your existing co-authorship situation. Mm-hmm. There's always the potential for conflict when you have two two creators on one project. So it's not that it's any worse than it is now. unless you two could agree on one person and designate the literary executor for that particular work.
Got it. So here somebody's asking if the executor is personally liable for, well, they're saying for the debts of the estate, if there are debts, but
no, because the estate is responsible for the debts. And so nothing happens. Nobody gets any copyrights and gets anything until the debts are paid off.
And somebody's saying, can you have a literary executor without naming a general executor?
No. In a will, well, if you don't name your executor, the court will put one in for you.
Right. So better to select your own general executor, but that's more of a trust and estate.
Right. So I'm going to give you a great example. So Anne Hesh, the actress, just died without a will. So she doesn't have an executor. So she has, I think, two or three children. Her oldest son is 19. So he petitioned the court to be named the administrator, which is the equivalent of the executor when there's no will. Well, Anne Hesh's boyfriend is saying, this kid's 19 years old. He shouldn't manage the estate. That's crazy. And also she wanted me to inherit everything or a substantial chunk of it. And so what he wanted to do was hire an independent fiduciary to manage the estate. And I mean, to a certain degree, that makes sense. But the court, I think it was just this week, the court said no, that the son is an adult and he's going to be put in place to do it. And the kids will likely inherit everything. Because if you die without the will and you've just got a lover on the side and you've got kids, the kids are going to get everything under the law, regardless of what you wanted. So the key is put it in writing, legally enforceable before you die. Yeah.
We just had, and somebody again was asking if you can use a percentage of your royalties as the executor's compensation. I think you said that was totally fine. But somebody else is asking if there's sort of a windfall of income. Can the literary executor decide how the income gets dispersed?
So that depends on how you're doing it. If you're doing it in a trust, so say a big slug of income comes into the trust because of some play, hit it big, whatever. Your trust document typically will say how the money is to be dispersed to the heirs. In most cases, trusts, the other benefit of a trust, I said there's lots of reasons to have trusts. One of the benefits of the trust is that it prevents your heirs from wasting the money, and will typically say, my heirs can have this money for their support, maintenance, education, living expenses. And if it's not being used for those specific things, it's going to stay here churning away, earning interest and being invested. And typically the trustees would have the power to decide how that money is invested. Yes. So it's basically your trust document controls how that's all handled.
So I hope you'll join us for the rest of the week. For now, Ellen, thank you again so much. And hopefully, and if anyone wants to reach Ellen, her website is in the chat. So feel free to reach out to her or reach out to info@thedgcm.com, and we will be happy to connect you to Ellen if that's easier.
Great. Thank you.
That's it. All right. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.